don't think everyone is an entrepreneur. It's the same way saying that not everyone's a 6'5" hyper athletic basketball player. And what I mean by that society's way of defining an entrepreneur is meaningfully different from the actual definition of entrepreneur. If you want to determine whether or not you are a resilient person, will proactively put yourself in uncomfortable situations and see what happens.
Do you agree with investing in like your people's training and development?
This is a little controversial, and I've definitely upset some people over the years with this response, but I think that's some of the best things that a business can invest in, because it will unify your culture and your decision-making process far more rapidly than spending money helping people to develop role-specific capabilities.
What do you look for when you're investing in founders?
In my opinion, the best founders are typically ones that sit at the intersection of intelligence, integrity, and energy. Everyone has a great idea, but not everyone can deliver the idea. Differentiates the people who win from those who don't is the capacity to bring the idea to life.
When you think about leadership and management for building a high-performing, high-growth company, what do you think about?
Management is about getting things done right, and leadership is about knowing what things to get done.
What about your view, agree, disagree on increasing salaries annually?
I guess, again, it's a little controversial. I think in a normal environment.
At what point did you, recognize that you were built to be a founder?
Well, sometimes I like to be hyper transparent here and say, like, I probably didn't realize what founder or entrepreneur was. I didn't really even probably know that those words existed when I actually started. Because my first sort of few business ventures, sort of 19, 20 years old, I didn't really see it as I'm going to go be a business person. I kind of just saw it as, I'm like, I could probably build this to make an income, to solve my problem of income whilst at university. So I never really saw it as like I could become a founder or I am an entrepreneur. I just saw it as I have this problem, how can I solve it? And then once that sort of started to work, that then created the next problem for me, which was I was like, well, I wonder if I could do this bigger. And then that was a bit of a bouncing ball that I kind of followed over the first sort of 3 to 5 years. So I'd never really considered that was who I was or what I was going to be. It just kind of happened that way.
Interesting. Knowing what you know now, why do you think founders typically fail?
Well, I mean, if we let's start from the position that not all businesses and or founders fail because of the founders in some regard. So like what I mean by that is that some ideas are just the wrong ideas at the wrong time. And I think to blame, especially first-time founders and entrepreneurs, be perhaps a bit harsh. It'd be like putting someone in a sport for the first time and be like, why'd you fail? It's like, well, you have no idea what you're doing, right? So I think firstly, some ideas are kind of just the wrong ideas. Some ideas can be the right ideas at the wrong time. But then the kind of last groups are the right idea at the right time, but with the wrong execution. That's more kind of founder, accountable, if you want to think of it that way. And most of the people that fall into that bucket, so they kind of have a decently good idea at a decently good time that unfortunately maybe have poor execution. Normally it's the execution that actually is causing the failure. And so like, when I use the word execution, that's kind of proxy for knowing what to focus on when, and then when you're focusing on that, how to actually bring that to life. Because the reality is ideas are kind of a much of a muchness. Everyone has a great idea, but not everyone can deliver the idea. And that's the core differentiator, in my opinion, between, even just managers, and business owners. But of course, kind of founder entrepreneurs, the core thing that differentiates the people who win from those who don't is the capacity to bring the idea to life, not to have a great idea.
Execution. What do you look for when you're investing in founders?
So execution is a big one, but in my opinion, the best founders are typically ones that sit at the intersection of intelligence, integrity, and energy. And this is an idea from Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, the way they used to look at their management teams. And what I mean by that is like that's not a mandatory collection of criteria, but it's a more predictable, reliable set of criteria. So when I say that, I mean not everyone that is a founder has to be super smart. Not everyone that is a founder is actually a great person, and not everyone that is a founder has huge energy and massive work ethic. There's actually a lot of people that are founders that become quite successful that don't fit those criteria. but I'm not investing in those ones, right? So if I was looking to invest in people, for me, I would want it to be predictable and a defendable decision, and therefore I would say, well, I think I need to have belief that you are decently intelligent, have high integrity, so a great person, and also have a good energy to be around and a huge work ethic. Because at the end of the day, like a lot of investing is a lot of the time, especially for smaller businesses, like much earlier on in the journey, VC or seed or angel style investing. So long as the idea has the potential to be somewhat economically viable, really it's all reliant on execution. Now, if you're investing in larger businesses that already are going concern, it's a slightly different set of considerations. But for the early on stage, yeah, for sure.
Looking at, like, for example, Apple, you've got jobs, sales, marketing, you've got Wozniak technical. If you're looking, like, do you prefer two founders where there's one technical, one sales, or would you prefer?
Like, after sort of 10, 15 years doing this, the single conclusion that I come to for all problems in business is that the answer is always, it depends. Right. And to respond to that, I would say, well, it depends precisely what the business is. And there's an important idea here that's worth considering, and that is that if you are investing in every business, unless you're a venture capital investor, you're not actually investing in the business going up 200 to 300 times in value or more. You're actually investing in something much, much more less sexy and less exciting, but still a good return. And the reason why that matters is because when you look at the profile of the people who are either sole founders or kind of co-founders in a particular industry or category of business, you want sometimes slightly different skill sets. So it's not always as simple as we want like a sales marketing person and a kind of product and dev person. But if you're looking at those specific examples, like a hyper rapid growth, technology company that's a new business model and a new category or disrupting a pre-existing category, then you probably want a technical co-founder because it's a massive advantage early on. You can save so much time, and you probably want a sales, marketing, and or kind of product person, depending on the way that you define those things, because that's also a massive shortcut. But if you're a world where you have one founder who's just sales and marketing, they'll kind of burn time, money, and energy on tech that they otherwise didn't need to burn. Yeah. If you have just a technical founder, they typically don't have a great understanding of sales and marketing. So then you kind of burn money and waste time over here doing that. So I think that's a decent model, and it's a kind of a tried and tested model in a certain context and a certain time for a certain type of business.
Interesting. What's your stance on, everyone being built for entrepreneurship?
I don't think everyone is an entrepreneur, and I don't say that as a derogatory, position. That's not what it's meant to be. It's the same way of saying that not everyone's a 6'5" hyper athletic basketball player, right? And what I mean by that, it's probably worth contextualizing that society's way of defining an entrepreneur is meaningfully different from the actual definition of entrepreneur, despite the fact that people like to argue what an entrepreneur is or should be defined as. So when you ask that question, my assumption is that you say, well, to be an entrepreneur means, go build a big, sexy business, make money, tech, sell it, rah, because a lot of people will look at it that way. But if we were to look at the etymology or the origin of the word entrepreneur, we would find that it was initially coined by a French economist, Jean Say, and after several revisions, the definition of the word effectively landed in a position that was, well, an entrepreneur is someone that moves economic resources from a place where they're generating low return and reallocates them to an area that has high return. So it's not actually, yes, there is other aspects of the origin of the word that are around innovation and change and this, that, the other, but the actual origin, the initial starting point for the word was simply someone who moves things that don't perform well, their resources into an area that does, right? And so you could, by that definition, you could be an entrepreneur building a very non-sexy business, just building something you like. So if we were to look at it through that definition, most people have some degree of creative outlet or interest, so sure, they could probably do that. But if we look at today's, kind of more colloquial view and said, well, it's about building huge companies, being rah-rah and tech and selling the company, this, that, and the other, that's less likely. And that's less likely because not everyone perfectly fits the profile from a psychology standpoint to do that. It's not necessarily a great decision for everyone.
How old were you when you started Sweat?
I think the first iteration was literally boot camps. So that was actually the origin of the business. And that I must have been about 19 or 20 years old, I think, when I started that. But that rapidly transitioned from kind of personal training, group fitness, ebooks, and then you're into an app over only a couple of years. So it was a pretty rapid kind of change cycle.
What's your view on like age in Australia? Because like there's Tall Poppy, right? Like I started my first company at 25.
Yeah.
And I always felt like people were looking a bit down on me.
Oh, 100%.
What was your vibe on that?
Yeah, that was definitely an experience. Both, I mean, the two things that were probably biggest to me, one was, recruiting people to work with the business. Because if you've got a 21, 22-year-old person coming to interview you and you're in your 40s or 50s, not everyone who is in that age bracket is going to receive that well. And when I say that, receive the idea that someone half my age is potentially going to be my boss, or the way they would see it. To me, it didn't really mean anything. Like I was kind of age agnostic in the sense I was like, I just want great people. I don't care if you're 25 years old or 65 years old. It makes no difference to me. But a lot of people from an employment perspective struggle with that. And then probably even more so, you're in the more corporate world. So if we were looking for like lawyers and accountants for advice, or trying to do partnerships or whatever with other organisations, that became quite challenging because they would kind of take the position, well, like, what the hell do you know if you're kind of this age? And they didn't really welcome interest from a much younger person.
I feel like it differs like USA to Australia around age experience.
It's a bit of a cultural thing. So every country has their own kind of predefined culture. And when I say that, it's not that everyone has those views, but on average, more people than not have those views. And in America, the idea of starting a business, or even like thinking about starting a business, like maybe even just having an idea, is celebrated. Because it's cool. You could kind of go and do that. Whereas in Australia, the default position is almost the complete opposite. It's like, well, but why would you do that? You go to university, you get a degree, buy a home. And I understand that that's the norm, in some way. But if you are someone who's trying to build an organisation and or design a better life, you're not actually looking for the norm. Like, so the self-evident truth here is that if you are even remotely interested in doing those things, any of the advice, perspective, or opinion of people that don't desire that is in some regards redundant. So outside of like specific subject matter stuff, of course, but like in a general sense, if you're like, I'm thinking about starting a business, and the majority of people who have no interest in that are telling you it's a stupid idea, well, their perspective isn't actually necessarily valid in a general sense, right? And this is one of the things that a lot of people who do decide to kind of go down this path struggle with a lot, and that is that pretty much from the day that they decide to do this, a huge portion of their life is no longer relatable to the majority of society, because they can't understand or comprehend what and why you are choosing to do that.
Makes sense. What's the hardest thing you've had to do in order to become the person you are today?
I mean, look, running and building businesses is full of uncomfortable stuff. Like it's pretty much perpetual in nature. And when I say that is, if you want to run a really high-performing business, right? If you're kind of happy to cruise along and get kind of moderate results and whatever, then you don't necessarily need to be as uncomfortable all the time. But that will probably lead to unwanted discomfort in the mid to long term, because if you don't focus on performance now, performance will become a problem down the track. So if you are trying to run an organisation that kind of has above market performance or above average performance, then you have a huge amount of like discomfort perpetually. It never kind of goes away. And that comes in the form of pretty much telling people that maybe they're not doing what they're meant to be doing, trying to keep them accountable, sometimes letting people go. And for me in my career, terminating someone's employment is challenging in a general sense, because they've got a life and maybe a family or whatever that that they're building. But firing someone who is an asshole is a lot easier than firing someone who is a lovely person but just is not able to deliver the results that the business needs. And so for me, there's been certain times throughout my career where I've had to have those conversations with people who are I would consider some of them friends. Great people, really love being around them, but regardless of kind of the advice or support, they're not able to get the result.
Yeah.
And one of the core things that a lot of people, both business owners and not, misunderstand is that employment isn't family. Like, so being employed and being family are two completely different things, in a simple principle that family and family love in a general sense should be realistically unconditional, right? So we will unconditionally love you and take care of you and help and support you, right? No ifs, buts, or maybes. Employment is the complete opposite. It is fully conditional. Employment is fully conditional on the fact that you keep paying me and I deliver you the result. Because if you don't keep paying me, well, I'm not going to keep showing up.
Yeah.
And then the other way around from the business owner's perspective, if you don't deliver the result, well, I'm not going to keep paying you. But a lot of people struggle to comprehend that, especially in small, fast-growing organizations, because there's so much emotion, both positive and challenging, that surround the experience that they have. So if you've been working with someone for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and you've had a huge amount of success together, you've bonded, in that success. And then ultimately the point in time where maybe they need to be moved on because they're no longer performing, regardless of their historical performance, that in some regards feels like a breakup.
Yeah.
It's a really, really challenging experience. And for the founder, it's the dealing of personal loss, like from a friendship perspective, but then also professional obligation. And sometimes there's guilt that comes along with that.
How have you I'm just curious to know, how have you learned to build resilience? Like you were talking about obviously building high growth businesses. It comes with fire extinguishing out all day problems.
Yeah.
Did you always have a strong threshold of resilience, or was that being built over time?
It's a hard thing to quantify or qualify, right? So how do you kind of ever realistically know how resilient you are? One of the ideas that I've adopted over the last sort of 5 or so years is that if you want to determine whether or not you are a resilient person, will proactively put yourself in uncomfortable situations and see what happens. And the irony of that is that if you are trying to test and measure your resilience, you will progressively and in some cases rapidly build more resilience. And the idea here is it's sort of like exposure therapy, right? If you want to see if you can tolerate the cold, an ice plunge bath, whatever they are, if you want to see if you can tolerate that, we'll just go do it. Mm-hmm. And if you want to see if you can keep tolerating that, we'll just keep doing it. And so from a resilience standpoint, I don't necessarily see this as you either kind of do or do not have it, because I think it's context-based and I think it changes a lot over time. And what I mean by that is if you are, in a general sense, massively emotionally overwhelmed, the likelihood is that your resilience at that point in time is lower, than a time when you're kind of feeling okay and you're mentally and emotionally level-headed.
True.
Right? And so from a business perspective and a life perspective in some regards, if you want to become a really resilient person, then proactively and frequently put yourself in environments that demand it. And if that is concerning to you or worrying to you, then that's the exact alarm bell that should signal you to do it, right? Because it's really easy to reason your way out of hard things that you don't need to do. So you don't need to do a plunge bath, right? You don't need to go do this workout today. You don't need to have that hard conversation today, or so the stories would go. But then the obvious question that you should be using to calibrate your own behavior in the short term should be, well, if not now, when? It's not if not now, why? It's if not now, when? Mm-hmm. Because why is redundant. If you've identified that this thing is uncomfortable or challenging and I will do it at some point, that's kind of you're reasoning your way out of it, as opposed to, well, it's uncomfortable, do it now. Yeah, and this is a mentality that a lot of people, I'm sure have spoken about before, and it's not necessarily kind of a new idea, but the new idea is to just do it.
I hear Rogan talking about it a lot. Mm. Is there a specific book that has significantly impacted your life, personally or professionally?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because a lot of people would think, what one thing do I kind of go read to, change my life? And reading is doing something, of course. But I'm not necessarily sure I'm of the belief that any one thing can have a monumental, life-changing impact on anyone in the general sense. And what I mean by that is that it's not just the one act or the one experience that changes you. It's how you respond to that in the short and mid to long term. Those behaviors and choices that actually change you over time. And so from a book's perspective, sure, there's lots that I've read that I'll go, that was really informative. That definitely nuanced my perspective on this one topic. But the thing that massively transformed my life was doing the reading all the time. It wasn't a book. Okay. The one thing that transformed my business performance wasn't uncovering one new secret trick, this, that, or the other. It was working thousands of hours. Yeah, and so I think a lot of people have this back to front, because the question is sort of like saying, well, what's the one supplement that you took in the gym to get really good results? Like, well, I just did lots of fucking exercise.
Yeah.
Like, and so there's a huge amount of, if anyone wants to know where all the secrets are in the reps, right? Because like it's a stupid idea, in my opinion. It's a really, really naive idea to say, oh, what's the one thing I can kind of do or look at that's going to like shortcut me to the end? And it's like, well, but you can't see the end because you haven't done the reps. The only way you can see this is by doing the reps to get you there. And like the idea of this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently, and that is that if a beginner is watching an expert, the things that the expert are doing that make them an expert are not, like, they're imperceptible to the beginner, so they can't see them, right? As a beginner looking at the expert, they just see, wow, you are awesome. When most people look at Michael Jordan or Khabib Nurmagomedov fight or whatever it may be, or a business person who's talking through their decision-making process. For a beginner watching an expert do any of those things, they can't even really properly see or understand what they do that they're not able to currently do. All they know is that it's better. And the only way to bridge that massive gap is to progressively do the reps hundreds and thousands of times so that you can actually see what is and isn't working. You can't just watch one fight or watch one athlete play or read one book or ask one question and kind of shortcut, right? Like, the secret is in the reps.
If there's a founder listening to this now, right, or even someone who's wanting to become a founder, and they want an unfair advantage into just running a business,
sure,
what would your advice be?
Work as much as is humanly possible, so long as you're being productive, in that time. Learn as much as possible while you're working, and avoid doing anything else if possible. And like what I mean by that, that's kind of like how many kind of quality reps can you get in in a particular period of time. And the thing here is a lot of people. So again, you're coming back to the book thing. A lot of people are like, oh, what's the one book that I should read? Well, I've reread the same books many times and learnt very different things from the same book over the years, right? So there isn't really like one immediate shortcut. Maybe the secret sauce here is stop thinking, start doing.
I like that.
Yeah, because everyone will go like, oh, I've been thinking about doing this. Like, I don't want to hear about what you're thinking about. Like, I want to hear about what you're doing. It's sort of like people want to hear about the holiday. They don't want to hear about the planning, right? Like, they want to, you realistically should spend less time, as weird as it may sound, less time talking about what you're doing and just more time doing it.
Executing. I reached out to an early stage employee of Sweat. She's not there anymore when you guys were getting off the ground.
Yeah.
And I texted her and I said, hey, if there's one word that you could use to describe your experience there, what would it be? And she said, life-changing. And so it got me thinking, and I was like, and I wanted to ask you, like, what type of culture, were you looking to build there and why?
Yeah. So, I mean, transparently, I didn't even know the word culture existed for the first few years. From my perspective, it was just winning.
Okay.
And the definition of winning changed a lot, over the years. But yeah, I would have thought that if you spoke to a lot of the employees, or at least the ones that had, kind of more regular interaction with me, the majority of them would probably say that the constant focus was just on more, next, winning. Now, that has pros and cons. Like, there's pros and cons to that mentality. But I think, more towards the end, maybe the repositioning of those things would be, kind of understanding detail and sophistication, because it ended up being that focusing on the end goal is less important than focusing on the behavior and activities that will actually get you there. But I think there's not many organisations that exist in a general sense. Like Sweat is a part of a minority in the sense that they kind of show up, grow rapidly, kind of a part of a big industry transformational change over a very, very short period of time. So, like for some of these people, we had people who were like, literally it was their first job and they were spending 4 months of the year overseas, like trying to figure things out. Like, there's not many places you can go and that be your first job to do that. If you're an engineer, there's not many organizations in the world that you can go work for that you go and, spend 3 months living in an underground basement working with Apple on special projects, right? There's not a lot of those sort of experiences. So it's nice to hear that, there was someone with a life-changing experience. But I think, from our perspective, it really was just always about trying to figure out the next win. What was the next best opportunity for us to win in?
Do you agree with investing in like your people's training and development?
Yeah, maybe this is a little controversial, and I've definitely upset some people over the years with this response, but I think there's some worthwhile nuance to consider in what I'm about to say. So, in a simple sense, do I think organisations should kind of prioritise and/or invest in developing their employees? Yeah, I think that's a very obvious and well accepted idea. But if we come a few layers down from that and say, well, when we use the word like develop, or develop employees as an idea, what do we precisely mean? And normally you can have like a really big dividing line down the middle here and say you've got like kind of role-specific capabilities and then general business skill. And so when we use role-specific capabilities, if you're in marketing, well, that's learning more marketing stuff. And if you're in engineering, that's kind of learning more engineering stuff, right? And so in a normal environment, so where something hasn't materially all of a sudden changed, the role-specific capability that people present, that's their value to sell on the market to companies, right? So if I'm a person in marketing, my marketing skill is effectively an aspect of what I sell to you. So it doesn't necessarily always make the most sense for businesses to be paying for your career development to develop you to make you more valuable in that category over time. And also, if a company is having to do that perpetually to help employees keep up, well, you probably have the wrong employee in that specific role-based skill set, right? If you cross over that big fence, though, and you go into kind of general capabilities, so leadership, management, communication, commercial decision-making, if you're not in finance, financial literacy, these sorts of things, I think as a group of general development things, I think that's some of the best things that a business can invest in. Because it will unify your culture and your decision-making process far more rapidly than spending money helping people to develop role-specific capabilities.
Makes sense. What about your view, agree, disagree on increasing salaries annually?
I guess, again, it's a little controversial. I think in a normal environment, so kind of something that's not cataclysmically changed in recent times, in a normal environment, people's salaries should go up based on the market value for their role or skill set over time, right? And a lot of people will simplify and use inflation, for example, as a way to kind of peg that to it. But once you get outside of kind of acceptable award rates, in Australia it's very different, in other countries like America is very different. But once you get outside of kind of the standard accepted award rates, there's a lot more complexity and nuance here than just simply we give pay rises. And also too, I think a lot of the time people are making pay rise decisions purely through the lens of what was their salary and what should it be, and also what's going to make them kind of happy, right? As opposed to, well, like this is one expense line as a component of the whole organization. And it's typically one of the biggest or the biggest investment line for the company. So any substantial changes here can't happen in isolation. So what I mean by that is that if a company never changed the price of its product, for example, but every year increased the salary of the employees, well, then that means the company is getting progressively less profitable in a vacuum, right? And so none of that is to say that people shouldn't get pay rises, but I don't think that it should be as simply accepted as, inflation was massive, so we just pay you more. Because inflation is also, at least the way it's spoken about publicly, it's a broad spectrum figure, an average applied across a huge amount of different areas, when the reality is that if you look at an organisation like Sweat, well, technology roles had substantially greater wage inflation than administrative roles for 2020 to 2022. It was like literally nearly 10 times different, right? So to take like a standard peg of inflation and go, we'll just imply that to everyone, it's a very low fidelity view. And coming back to the things before around what kind of makes people successful or not as founders, it's not making low fidelity decisions all the time. Because if you're not in the detail, how do you expect to make good decisions?
I like that. I want to talk about vision, mission, values, right?
Yep.
You hear about it a lot. I've been through countless exercises with external consultants. How did you go about bringing it into the DNA of the company? So it's not just sitting on the website, on the walls, in onboarding books. How do you bring it into the fabric of the business?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, from just as a headline perspective, I don't necessarily think that all businesses need all of them, which is very anti a lot of what a lot of people say. I think every organization needs a purpose, I think, and every organization needs a set of values. Whether or not you need to have, vision and or mission, I think is context dependent. But if we just add some, context here. So in my opinion, a purpose for an organization is a statement, ideally one sentence, right? That represents the core reason for existence. So like in a simple sense, what do you do for who and how?
Yeah.
Right? And so that purpose statement should then be relied upon to calibrate most macro or strategic decisions in the organization. So for Sweat, if our purpose statement was to empower women with fitness, right, we had our own kind of proprietary definitions at different points that were different over time for, when we said women, how do we define that? So for us, our customer base was, this age, these countries, these goals, right? And then our definition of fitness then was reflecting the balance between who they were and what they wanted and the way that we delivered it to them. So initially, if you went way back before we even had that statement, we were delivering it in boot camps, and then we were delivering it in ebooks, and then we were delivering it in an app, right? And so that statement was kind of universal across the organization for quite a few years. Then the values piece, in my opinion, kind of company or operating values. I like to use the term operating values because they're values behind which you operate. They're not just what does the company like or do.
Yeah.
That the operating values are effectively your accepted behavioral standards for the organization. A lot of people will, in my opinion, misappropriate that and go, we value community. Right? That could be a brand value, something that you position yourself as from an outwards facing perspective. But like internally, that doesn't necessarily drive a behavior, right? So if in my organizations, for example, like, frugality, is a value. I don't see the point in wasting money or spending money if we don't need to, right? Meritocratic decision making is a value because I believe in the best decision winning, not the person with the biggest job title or the biggest salary or the most experience. It's the best decision, right? So these are things that guide, behavior, right? So I think that every organization needs, a purpose and a set of operating values, the way that I've defined them. Whether you need kind of a mission and or a mission and or a vision, in my opinion, like I actually think a lot of the time, a couple of things are true. One, I don't think anyone even knows what they're trying to say when they say vision or mission. I don't even think they know how they're differentiated, right? Number one. Number two, I don't think they understand how to connect that to decision making. And if you're not connecting it to decision making, well, what's the point of having it, right? And then three, I think probably 90% or more of all businesses that are being built exist. So their purpose, they exist for something that already exists. So you're not necessarily actually trying to do something visionary. You're not necessarily on a mission to massively change something. You're just trying to win in something that already wins. So for example, like most real estate agencies that start between now and the next 20 years will probably roughly do the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like most marketing agencies will roughly do the same thing. And they might think that they're innovating and this, that, and the other, but that's either A, mostly not true, and or B, even if it is true, it's not super visionary, world-changing stuff. And again, that might upset people because people like to feel like they're going to have a legacy and that they're building a really, really kind of special or unique vision. But 99% probably, 99% of things that happen in business and or 99% of businesses aren't new ideas. They're not done that differently or that unique. They're not super sexy or visionary. They're just businesses.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you looked at a P&L?
Well, I didn't know it was a P&L. When I was looking at it, to be honest, I had kind of no idea. I had no financial literacy, almost zero financial literacy, and I mean that truthfully. I had very limited financial literacy up until I was making well over $20 or $30 million a year, which is super scary. Because now that I work with people who are making sometimes a lot less than that, I'm like, I need to help you because this is going to save you so much pain, in the future. But yeah, I mean, I would have been looking at P&Ls when I was honestly probably 15 or 16 years old working in a music shop. Like I would have seen versions of them then, not really properly understanding what they were. But my own ones, probably 19, 20 years old, I would have started digesting them.
What would you recommend to people who, running a business and like you, at the early stage, they just no idea. They might have a fractional CFO or something, but what do you recommend to upskill?
Yeah, I think I do think finance is something that needs to be a kind of personal adventure, and it needs to be a perpetual adventure. And what I mean by that is that there is, even for me now, and I'm really interested, like I'm personally interested in this stuff, every few weeks or few months, I'm learning something materially new in finance. Right? I don't think that it really kind of ever ends. Like you don't learn, a P&L is a profit and loss statement, and there's kind of statutory and management accounting versions of that roughly are structured like this for the following reasons. You don't just kind of stop there. And so I think for all people, I think, at minimum, they should probably read a book called Financial Intelligence for Entrepreneurs, because that's a really good, it's a kind of white and dark green cover. I think that's like a really great kind of foundational, piece of knowledge. The second thing is I think everyone should bookmark Investopedia in their browsers, and whenever they don't know what a word means or an idea means in finance, they should just go into Investopedia and search for it, because it's, in my opinion, one of the best resources, or Corporate Finance Institute. And then the third thing I think is having a fractional CFO or equivalent person, I think is a really good idea. But I would caveat that by saying, absolutely do not get a fractional CFO that's only ever been an accountant, like a professional accountant. You realistically want a fractional CFO who's actually been a CFO and who ideally has like deep management accounting experience, not just accounting as a service experience. Because it's sort of like English and Chinese in some regards. There's still universal language principles in some regard that sit over it, but they are effectively kind of two different languages and exist for two fundamentally very different purposes.
Have you heard of a book called Scaling People?
No.
By a lady called, I think, Claire Hughes Johnson. She was like a prominent exec at like Stripe and Google.
Yeah.
And the book's basically about how to like breed effective leadership and managers in high growth environments.
Yeah.
And there was an excerpt in the book that talked about distinguishing like leadership and management.
Yeah.
And they were saying that, I'm paraphrasing, like they were saying like leadership is strategic.
Yeah.
Management is about implementation.
Yeah.
And leadership's around like direction, where we're going, why we're going, empowering, convincing people as to why we're going from A to Z, setting the standards, the expectations, the tone.
Yeah.
And then, the management is the implementation of that.
Yeah.
And then, building the people, building the team, the systems, the processes, executing. When you think about like leadership and management for building like a high-performing, high-growth company, like what do you think about?
Yeah. So I tend to agree with most of that. That's effectively a modern day, modernized or paraphrased version of like Peter Drucker's original definition of this, which I think was in the 50s or 60s. He in a simple sense said that management is about getting things done right, so execution, implementation, and leadership is about knowing what things to get done. Right. So in other words, direction, like where are we going, kind of why, what do we have to do to get there? And I think like in my opinion, I certainly kind of adopt and agree with that idea. I think one of the massive disconnects that happens with these pieces of literature, and even Peter Drucker's, which I would say in my opinion is some of the best business literature available, probably is that that's an explanation of like what is this thing and like why is this thing useful or kind of valuable. But it's actually these are the ideas, right? But it's quite different from how you actually then do that. So I often look at this as kind of like knowledge, like bridging the knowledge and skill gap. So like using sports or martial arts. Like I can say to you, hey, so this is how to do this armbar, and you can go, I can like fully understand that. That makes sense. And we do the armbar because in this particular context, it's good for these reasons, right? But that doesn't necessarily actually allow your body to then do that to another person's body. It just means that you have some knowledge on it, but you don't necessarily have the skill. And then you would go to try to do that and then realize it's a lot harder in reality than it is in your mind. And I think this type of informational learning in this regard is kind of somewhat similar, because the obvious question that should follow on from that is like, okay, well, if management is about getting things done right and implementation, execution, well, how the hell do you do that?
Yeah.
Like, well, what does that mean? Yeah. And so people can kind of go, oh, yeah, I agree with that. That's the idea. But it's like, well, but what the hell do you actually do day to day to make sure that things do get done right? Like, what actually is the skill? So the understanding of management being largely about, governance and execution has no relationship to how the hell you actually achieve that day to day.
What are the skills then you think of when you think of like a savage and effective manager?
Yeah.
What are the skills?
Financial literacy, verbal or kind of written communication skills. Being able to kind of bridge that with like commercial decision making. What I mean by that is there's sometimes this might be legally right or financially right, but that person might not like it. So how do you kind of bridge? The commercial aspect is how you bridge and bring all that together, and being able to kind of influence and motivate people. So the kind of people skills. There's lots of stuff here, but at a macro level, I'd say those are the ones that stand out to me at least at this point in time. And so when it comes down to like actually getting things done with other people, well, you're going to make a whole bunch of decisions. They need to be able to understand why. You're also going to be asking them to make a whole bunch of decisions. They need to understand how to present those decisions to you. So you have to have good written, verbal communication and financial literacy, and you have to set that expectation for those people. And the reason why that matters is because if you can help them understand that, then their decision-making skills get better. So you can rely less on yourself doing the work and rely more on them doing the work, right? Yeah. But then obviously as you go through that process, people will from time to time disagree with things or not understand things or not want to do things. So then you have to be able to influence them and motivate them to kind of adopt and do certain things. Then over time, as people start to kind of be able to focus on the right things and get the right things done, they will then need to interact with other people. So they need to understand how to bridge the kind of binary financial or legal truth and the commercial best practice. So then how do you bring that together, which is the bridging of these kind of skills all together, right? And so, like to put this in simple terms, right? Like most people who are managers don't know how to run effective one-on-ones, like weekly meetings. True. Most people who are effective managers don't understand that they could have almost zero small meetings if they had more effective group meetings. And most people don't understand that you don't need that many group meetings if your way of doing work is effective. Most people don't understand that you can have far less reporting if you have one or two really good reports that are well understood, right? And so these are kind of management tools, if you will, to actually get things done right, the right way, on time, on budget, for example, with less effort from you. And I always look at management team sophistication across a few lenses. One is how big is the variance between your budget and what actually happened? So how many % above or below or whatever were you for a particular period, say kind of quarterly or whatever it may be. So how big is the VAR or variance is one core indicator. The second indicator is like, well, how many unscheduled kind of short-term meetings are being thrown into your calendar? Because if you have a lot of short-term shit being thrown in your calendar, then something isn't working in the pre-existing process. Yeah. So in other words, how predictable is your work output? So how predictable are the outcomes, budget, and how predictable are the work output, right? And then how predictable are the decisions that get made by a team of people that are not you? Because if your team are making decisions very differently to you, there's a really big cultural gap, right? If your calendar is very unpredictable and sporadic, then your processes for getting work done aren't good. And then if your budget forecasts are materially inefficient and ineffective and inaccurate, well, then you're not good at predicting the outcomes of your work, and the work isn't a prediction of your decisions, right?
Good thinking. Effective meetings, like I know when Jobs was alive and Musk at the moment, very ruthless with their meetings.
Yeah.
Small amount of people.
Yep.
Very action focused.
Yep.
They're both renowned to walk out of meetings when they're not going the right way.
Yeah,
what does an effective meeting look like for you?
So start by the inverse, right? An ineffective meeting, in my opinion, is a workshop. I don't think there's almost ever a circumstance where workshops are very effective. And even if they are, it's normally like 3 people. Like if you're having a 10, 15, 20 person workshop to solve a problem, it's probably going to have a pretty terrible outcome, in my experience. Groupthink is very, very ineffective, right? So bad meetings, big workshops. That's number one. Number 2, bad meetings are presentations. I don't like to be presented to. I don't really agree in presentations. I agree in creating them for study and pre-read. And then the meeting should be debating truths, right? And this is probably one of my big things. So now flipping that to what are good meetings? Well, good meetings are about debating truth and using the debate of truth to get to decision. But even in that circumstance, a lot of that can happen outside of meetings. So like in my opinion, you don't actually need that many meetings in an organization, one that runs smoothly. You'll need a lot early on to kind of get things set up and get things going and whatever. But over time, you should actually be able to decrease the amount of meetings. And meetings should have a very specific purpose, to your point before, Bezos or Musk or Jobs or whatever, they're very kind of, focused on rapid decisions and your kind of commitment to actions, right? Because otherwise, like outside of that, what are you really doing? Like if you're having a meeting to discuss results, like, well, you could just read the report.
Mm-hmm.
You could debate why the results are the results. That would be more useful, and what you're going to do about it immediately, right? But to sit there and go, oh, well, we were 10% up on this and 2% up on that. It's like, yep, I can see that in the table. It's like, what's the point of the discussion? It's a waste of time.
That's fascinating. So people who are coming to your meetings, they all are very aware that we're going to be debating.
Yeah, that's for most meetings. That's a premise of the discussion. Yeah, it's a commitment to truth seeking. So coming back to the idea before, in the companies that I run or that I try to instill, this way of working in, meritocratic decision making. So making decisions that appear to be closest to the truth, not ones that come from the person who is senior or has a bigger salary or job title, right? And so a lot of the time it's kind of debating those things like, oh, well, why this, why that, why this, why that, right? But not, kind of fluffy rah-rah stuff. It's like, well, if you're saying this is the truth, then why am I seeing this piece of data that challenges that? As opposed to like, oh, well, we were 10% less efficient on customer acquisition. Oh, but, we saw our competitor who did this and, oh, there was a public holiday. And it's like, well, but like what's the real data? Not just, that's speculation, right? And I really don't like that. I really dislike speculation because it's a waste of time. It's no different to kind of fantasizing or having great ideas and doing nothing about it, right? It's kind of useless space. So, we, like, for example, in most of the companies that I'm deeply involved with, we have what's called an MBR, which is a monthly business review. And that business review, depending on the size of the company, is somewhere from 20 pages to 200 pages once a month. And the core purpose of that is to review the actual performance versus what was budgeted or forecast, depending on the time of the year. There is almost no discussion in those meetings about what happened because that's provided to you a few days in advance. So we know what's happened, right? And if you haven't pre-read that, then you're not doing your job, so you're underperforming. So when we send that out, we also send a separate document, which we call a Q log or a question log, that's segmented by section or function, depending on the way that the MBR content is laid out. And 2 or 3 days in advance, it is the expectation that all people who attend that meeting, management employees, will study the MBR and then itemize their list of questions. And then over that 72-hour period, the management team, individuals who own certain functions or are responsible for certain results, will, in an itemized fashion, respond to and justify answers to questions, to every single one of those questions. So then when we actually meet, we're not sitting there for 6 to 8 hours going through performance. Instead, we're going, well, hold on, I asked you this question, you gave me that answer, I don't agree with you. Because I see this that you're not seeing. Mm-hmm. And so I want to know if that's true. Or, okay, well, I asked you this and this is the truth. Okay, but that's not an acceptable result. That's just an answer or an explanation. So what are we doing now to improve that result?
Who inspired you with this, I guess, methodology of approaching meetings like this with debate?
Yeah, so versions of this kind of organically developed during some of my time at Sweat. And then, to be honest, that was probably largely as a result of my impatience because I'm not the most patient person in those environments. So that was the organic, I guess, at the inception of it. But then over time, as I brought in other employees who come from other high-performing organizations, they had kind of their own ideas to kind of integrate, to evolve, the way that we approach this. And they got kind of better and more rigorous over time. And then since, having sold the business and also stepped out of my role as CEO, and now I've kind of started, invested or bought in a few other companies, I've observed similar patterns here that present inefficiencies or problems, in these particular things, these particular activities and businesses. So I've kind of over time tweaked, and I continue to do that. Like that doesn't stop. Like I'm always looking for ways to do it more effectively. Like even with the actual monthly business review, presentation document, for example, I'm like, does this slide need to be here? Can I add something else that's shorter or better or more efficient at communicating the same idea?
Do you think self-awareness is like a really important aspect of effective leadership?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. I think, unfortunately, most people don't even really know what they're feeling at any point in time. And that's a really, sounds like kind of an insane statement, but like, there's been people in my life who I've met before and, they're having a whole bunch of trouble about a particular thing at, in work or whatever. And I'm like, oh, how are you feeling about it? And they're like, oh, no, it's okay. It's okay. And I'm like, oh, maybe you appear a little anxious. Is that a reasonable your assumption based on these behaviors. And like, no, I'm not really an anxious person. I'm like, oh, well, what's anxiety? Can you define it for me? And then, yeah, and then they're kind of like, they don't really know. And they're like, so how do you actually know if you're an anxious person if you can't define the word? And then we work through it and we go, oh, well, anxiety is, in a simple sense, worrying about something happening in the future. If you want, you're afraid of something happening in the future. It's like, okay, do you ever worry about things happening in the future? And all the time. Yeah, and a lot of people are this way. Like, really, even when we say like, oh, you're angry, sad, resentful, regretful, guilty, whatever it is. If you ask people like, what do we actually think those things mean? And then do you experience those things regularly? And not a lot of people think about that stuff. Therefore, they have low awareness, at least in this context of emotions. And then that lack of awareness drives inefficiency from a business decision-making perspective. And then outside of kind of emotional awareness, and you also have, I guess, like intellectual awareness, if you will. How aware are you of how much you actually know about something? It's like, are you an expert at this, or are you just okay? And one of the unfortunate things that exists in self-awareness from an intellectual standpoint is that it's really hard to gauge. So if I said to you, let's say you played tennis or you're a marathon runner, let's use marathon running, right? And you're like, oh, I'm a bloody expert at marathon running. It's like, well, how fast you run a marathon? Oh, I don't know, I do it in blah X amount of hours. Well, you're not an expert. You might have run a lot of them and you might like running them, but an expert will get better results, right? And so in business, it's really hard to calibrate and gauge, like, oh, I'm an expert in finance. How do you determine that? I'm an expert at marketing, and you could say, oh, well, you kind of get better results. But most people who think they're experts in marketing, one, don't even really know what the results are that they would use to grade themselves as being an expert.
Yeah.
And two, even if they did know the results, they wouldn't be able to say, well, but this result would make me an expert. And so as an example, let's use marketing, because it's a really kind of common and somewhat easy to understand one. If you were an expert at marketing, let's constrain this. E-commerce. You were an e-commerce marketing expert, and let's even narrow it further to paid advertising. Let's go all the way down to meta advertising. If you're a true expert, well, on a comparative basis, you would get better results. But how do I know what results other companies are getting? Almost impossible. Now, some ad platforms, TikTok and Meta will provide some comparative benchmarks sometimes. But they're normally like broad category comparisons. So it's not like you versus these two precise businesses who are identical at a similar stage of growth in a similar country selling a similar product. It's like, oh, well, clothing. Yeah, so that can be luxury, standard clothing, cheap clothing, women's, men's, whatever, right? And so the comparators are not always super reliable. So to become an expert at something and to self-proclaim that from an awareness perspective it's easy to fall into that trap in business.
What was your, talking about marketing, like your unfair, do you think, competitive advantage at Sweat with marketing?
Definitely like performance marketing, which was like media buying or like digital advertising for us. We went through a variety of different stages, but I'd say one of the core advantages was that we were quite a long way ahead of the average marketer. Now the average marketer is much better, than what they were, because there's more information publicly available and more examples of it now.
But why? Why were you more?
Well, so things that we were doing in 2014, 15, 16 are now just starting to be done by a lot of people. The way that we would do creative, the way that we would structure ad campaigns, the way that we would kind of try to accurately assess ROI. So like we were doing what we called so a lot of people will use e-com because it's an easier one to understand. People will go, oh, what's like the LTV you have a customer? And they would be doing a lifetime value, for those playing at home. They go, oh, our lifetime value is just, all this revenue divided by these customers. Well, that's wrong. That's an average of the lifetime value of all your customers ever. That's not actually individual customer lifetime value. So then we have to do cohort, LTV. And then within cohort LTV, we have to do cohort LTV. We have to understand based on demography, so kind of who people are, and what they do in our app, because we were kind of a system of engagement for workouts and whatnot. Based on what they do and who they are, or how do those things differ in LTV? So how do we know who to target in what countries, where, and what age, and what devices?
Yeah.
Right. And so, and just to be clear, that's relatively simple. I'm just keeping this high level. So we were looking at these things in a company of our size then. There was almost no companies in that industry category and no companies of that size doing that. Plenty of companies doing it. Massive gaming companies have been doing this for 15, 20 years. This isn't new. but it was new to that industry category and it was new to a business of that size because the level of sophistication to achieve that. So we had to build a whole own data science team. Now, if you want to understand, for example, in e-com, you want to do lifetime value cohort analysis, just pay for Lifetimely. The basic version is like $50 a month. We had to build a 4-person team to manually create our own versions of this.
Wow.
So we were quite a long way ahead of a lot of this stuff that is now like very easily available. Like if you had a Shopify store, you could set up Lifetimely in under 10 minutes. To do it back then, we worked for months, build our own data warehouse, get a BI tool, build out our own kind of proprietary algorithm for predicting lifetime value, use our understanding of those levers to then make advertising and marketing adjustments. Like very complicated then. Now it's pretty standard basic stuff.
And were you obviously hiring the intelligent people in that area?
So sometimes. So one of the tricks that I used to use was I'd spend a lot of my time in America and I'd just try to find, I literally would go LinkedIn hunting and try to find people who were doing this stuff at companies way bigger and more sophisticated than we were and just reach out to them and see if they'd be happy to chat and teach me some stuff. And then some of them were, the majority of them rejected me abrasively. But for the people that were, I'd catch up with them and I would literally hear things and learn things and even just like new words and and I just write them down, go away, research them and kind of self-discover, which then led me over time to know when we were recruiting for these people, like what was I actually looking for? I'm finding people who had actually done it. And so for example, one of the people who built out a lot of this kind of data and reporting infrastructure for us from an advertising perspective, like he came from a massive gaming company, like one of the world's biggest gaming companies.
Yeah.
And he was an absolute weapon.
I love that. So talking about execution, like obviously, has that been a big part of your life where like you mentioned that LinkedIn example you just got on there?
Yeah.
Is that always played out?
I think this idea of like being industrious is like quite underrated, right? It's very overpowered. People who refuse to accept that a problem exists without a solution or an increment towards a solution, they're normally really effective founders because they're self-driven problem solvers. A lot of people will understand the problem. They'll go, this is my issue. I can't get enough customers. And they'll kind of go, I'll get an agency. But that's not actually the problem. Like not enough customers is a symptom of poor marketing.
Yeah.
It's a symptom of lack of detail. It's a symptom of lack of understanding. And people very often get kind of cause and symptom or problem symptom, mixed up, right? And again, coming back to the whole emotional intellectual awareness thing, people will very often kind of go, we don't have enough customers. Agency, problem solved, because they emotionally want to get to the solution as quickly as possible. But that's no different to saying if I'm in cold water, I emotionally want to get out as quickly as possible, right? If I'm going for a long run, when it gets hard, I want to stop as quickly as possible. And so no different to running a marathon or being in super cold water. The solution here isn't to get out of the water. It's to not stop running.
Yeah.
Right? In business, it's to not immediately default to the first solution that comes to mind, unless you're a legitimate expert, because you can go, problem, seen this 10 times, these are the solutions. But for the other 99% of people who are not actual experts and have not actually resolved this problem before, then they need to not immediately go to an agency or whatever. They need to get onto Google, start researching, find people who know the problem, understand the problem, learn about the problem, and figure out a way where they can intimately understand it and then try to solve it.
Interesting. Shifting back to marketing,
Sure.
I'm curious to know your view on personal brand, like where we are today.
Yep.
And zoom out, fast forward 5 years. You're a founder or whoever you are. How important do you think it is?
Yeah, I think the idea that every single person in the world needs to have a personal brand is a little low fidelity, and I say that because publicly and socially, let's just say there's a few thousand billionaires in the world. 5 or 10 of them take up most of the media space. Mm-hmm. There's lots of really wealthy people that you have no idea who they are, and they're still super wealthy. Right. So if that was the goal, to become wealthy and to be successful in business, do you need a personal brand? You do not need one in all contexts, but it can be very useful in a lot of contexts, and it can be a very good way to become successful and to become wealthy if that's what your goal is. And I do think there's a lot of value in people who pursue development of their own brand, even if it does not add commercial value and even if that's not the goal, because there's lots of sort of extraneous value that comes from that. So one, you are forced to meet with a lot of new people, so you network. There's good value in that. Another thing is that you're typically forced to do public speaking or podcasts or whatever it may be. So you are progressively learning to become more articulate, right? Third is, as a result of these particular types of activities, you become exposed to a whole bunch of other information and environments that you otherwise would not have been. So even just regardless of any money or anything else that comes from it, just those few kind of categories, they are really, really great value streams for you. But I consider this to be a ratios thing. If your game is not personal brand and building and using that to leverage it in some way to make money or build a business, and you want to become wealthy and successful, if that's not going to be your core game, well, it can't take up all of your time, right? Like if your core game is going to be, I don't know, like manufacturing, and like most of the world are never ever going to see you, hear from you, and know who you are, you're probably better off trying to get really good at manufacturing and spending less time building your personal brand.
Sure.
And again, coming back to the emotional piece, some people, a lot of first-time founders, they attach a huge amount of success value to status. So they're like, oh yeah, I've built this business and that's great, but I have status because I've built it now, and as a result of that, I'm going to build my personal brand, and because my personal brand is better, I'm winning, right? But unfortunately, there's kind of no amount of personal brand that pays your bills unless it generates an income. And for the vast majority of people, their personal brand doesn't generate an income. And even if it does generate an income, the income is very, 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 very small, right? So it's not do or don't do. I think it's great for people to do. I think there's great skills to be built. But I think like the low fidelity view that every single person in the world must build a personal brand, I don't think is true.
Interesting perspective. Obviously, you mentioned before with Sweat, you guys were ahead of the curve with marketing, with what you were doing. Looking where we are today now, when you, I guess, think about people who are ahead of the curve with marketing, what comes up?
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe I would look at that and say, rather than people who are just materially ahead of the game on marketing in isolation, I would say that being good at marketing amongst the integration with other things has been very powerful. So like the Paul brothers, for example, who built their drink brand Prime, their personal brands and approach to marketing, whether you like it or dislike it, right, has built an incredibly good foundation for them to then leverage. I think they're doing deodorant brands and whatever it is as well now for men's products. So that approach to marketing, personal branding, kind of networking and talent networking has been highly cost effective for them to build mass attention and influence, which has been then very powerful to kind of build a business upon. There is also pros and cons to that, and there's also variable impacts in the short and long term, which I'm curious to see how those things play out. But that's probably an example. Those guys are doing some pretty good things from a results perspective. But I think in terms of like your individual organizations, a lot of what we see now, and again, e-commerce is a really kind of trendy space at the moment. A lot of what we see now is actually products that are being done differently, which allows them to be repositioned. Right, so it's not actually just that their marketing is way better. It's that the marketing is effective and they're doing a good job of the marketing, but because of the repositioning of certain products. There's a company that are building like detergent related products, but the product is not at all the same. It's kind of straps or patches or whatever. That's a really interesting, different thing to market. So making content for that, if you can do good content, is going to massively outperform other similar product marketing because it's more interesting, right? So it's not just the marketing being better. Sometimes it's the integration of kind of like NPD or new product development, creating an opportunity for new interesting content that then kind of grabs and works well online. It's not just we did a better video.
Yeah.
Because the reason why I think that's true, especially in the e-com space, the reason why I think that's true is because content creation, although there is kind of good, bad, and otherwise, it's becoming more of a commodity in the sense it's cheaper to produce now. There's better tools to help you produce it, et cetera, et cetera. If you go back 10 years ago, when Instagram was kind of first on the up and up, right, there was like almost no editing tools. There was like one or two editing tools. They were pretty much all desktop, not mobile. You didn't have a lot of AI stuff. You didn't have production studios. You didn't have any of these things. So to make one video was much, much, much harder. Now you can go iPhone, point, shoot, bang, AI editing app, bang, AI audio, bang, captions, bang, done. And you can do that with pretty much zero professional producing experience.
Technology is moving quick. Like I know, like I hear Sam Altman's in like a WhatsApp group with like who's going to become the first one-person billionaire.
Yeah.
AI is coming in. There's a lot of talk. What occupies your time in the future around like the business landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I whilst I really value a lot of those technologies, I also accept that I'm not necessarily going to be the person building them because it's not my core skill set and not something I'm passionate about. So I spend more of my time trying to generally keep up with what the kind of trends and tools are, and then finding interesting ways to integrate that into business to generate better results. So like from my perspective, something as simple as like using ChatGPT to help me problem solve and go from having like no knowledge to having a decent amount of knowledge in a topic really quickly. So rather than reading 20 or 30 or 40 books to get the baseline knowledge of something, ask some good questions, frame up some good references, use that to help me identify people who are experts, and then kind of go and do that. It's a much more efficient way of doing things. But technology-wise, I consider myself more of a passenger, I think, than the captain, as far as that's concerned.
Tobi, thank you. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks heaps for having me, mate.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.